A light rain drizzled over the Fairhaven police station's training yard, forming puddles on the cracked concrete. Officers from the K-9 unit stood silently as Rick Coleman, the head trainer, conducted another one of his rigorous evaluations. In the center of the scene, a small German shepherd puppy named Bob lay curled near a chain-link fence. His head was low, his front paw bandaged from an earlier training accident. For Coleman, Bob was just another failure, a dog that didn't meet the program's standards. "This one's out," Coleman declared flatly. "The injury will hold him back. He won't make it through field work." The trainer's words echoed across the yard, met with murmurs of agreement. To most of the officers, this was routine. Dogs that couldn't keep up were simply dismissed. But Detective Daniel Rourke remained still, his gaze fixed on the puppy. Something about Bob wouldn't let him look away. Daniel slowly walked over to the small dog, who didn't move except to shift his eyes slightly upward. The detective crouched beside him and gently extended his hand. Bob hesitated for a moment, his dark, cautious eyes locking onto Daniel's. There was a deep sadness in them, but also a flicker of hope. After a tense pause, the puppy leaned forward and pressed his cold nose into the detective's hand. A wave of emotion hit Daniel hard. He'd seen that same look in other people before, in children left behind by the system, in broken families, and in his own reflection on darker days. "I'm taking him," Daniel finally said, his voice steady as he turned to face Coleman. Coleman shook his head, chuckling with disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Rourke. This dog's a dead weight. He's gonna drag you down. Mark my words." Daniel didn't bother replying. He scooped Bob up into his arms, feeling the puppy tremble slightly before relaxing against him. The rain started coming down harder now, dripping down Daniel's face as he walked away from the yard. To the others, it probably seemed like an impulsive, foolish choice. But Daniel knew it was the right one. Bob wasn't going to be thrown away like some worthless burden. Not if he could help it. Want to know what the future holds for Daniel and Bob? Leave a like to support the channel and subscribe, so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. And comment below. I'm rooting for Bob. The rain had dwindled to a soft drizzle by the time Daniel pulled into his driveway. Beside him, Bob shifted nervously in the passenger seat. His small ears perked at the faint sound of rustling leaves, and his eyes flicked from side to side, still on edge. Daniel reached out and gave the dog a reassuring pat on the head. Bob relaxed for a moment, but the tension in his body didn't completely fade. Daniel sighed. He didn't blame him. Fear didn't disappear overnight. Not for dogs, not for people. "You're all right now," Daniel muttered as he stepped out of the car. He carried Bob inside the house, the flickering porch light casting long shadows on the wet ground. Once inside, he placed the puppy gently on a folded blanket near the couch. Bob sniffed around the room cautiously, his steps hesitant, as if unsure of his surroundings. He stayed close to Daniel, never straying too far. Daniel sat down heavily on the couch, his eyes following the small dog's every move. There was something familiar in Bob's behavior, something that reminded him of witnesses he had spoken to over the years. That guarded fear, the hesitation to trust anyone. He had seen it too many times before. The sudden ring of his phone broke the silence, jolting him from his thoughts. He frowned and grabbed it off the coffee table. Lisa Morgan. His partner rarely called him after hours unless it was serious. He answered, bracing himself. "Rourke," he said. "Daniel, it's about the Keller case." Lisa's voice came through, tense and urgent. Daniel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Keller case had haunted him for years. A young girl gone without a trace. No leads, no answers. It was one of the few cases that had truly gotten under his skin. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. A witness came forward. "They say they saw something the night she disappeared. The chief wants us in first thing tomorrow," Lisa explained. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. After 5 years of silence, it was hard to believe a new lead could suddenly appear. Still, he couldn't ignore it. "I'll be there," he replied. After ending the call, Daniel sat in the quiet for a long moment. Memories of the case resurfaced. Days spent searching through forests, nights poring over dead-end reports, and the guilt that had never fully left him. He glanced at Bob, who had curled up near the couch, his eyes half closed but still watching Daniel with quiet attentiveness. "We've both got things we can't let go of," Daniel whispered softly. Bob's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Outside, the rain began to pick up again, tapping gently on the windows. Daniel knew that tomorrow would bring more than just new information. It would drag him back into the past he had tried for so long to escape. Morning came like a weight on Daniel's chest. Sleep had been elusive, plagued by flashes of the Keller case. Forests drenched in rain, endless missing posters, and faces that never got closure. Now he stood in his kitchen, cradling a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, a dense fog hung over the street, blurring the outline of the neighborhood. At his feet, Bob lay quietly, his eyes following Daniel's every move. The dog hadn't strayed from him all night, as if he knew that something dark was looming over both of them. "Time to go," Daniel muttered, finishing the coffee in a single gulp. He grabbed his jacket, keys, and a leash. Bob's ears twitched nervously when Daniel clipped it on him, but he didn't resist. "It's just a quick trip, all right?" Daniel whispered, kneeling down to rub his head. Bob blinked, relaxing slightly before following him outside. The morning air was sharp and damp. Daniel shivered as he helped Bob into the passenger seat and got behind the wheel. The hum of the engine broke the eerie quiet as they drove toward the precinct. Lisa was already waiting outside the station when Daniel pulled into the lot. She leaned against one of the concrete pillars near the entrance, her arms crossed, a grim look shadowing her face. Daniel parked the car and stepped out, his gaze meeting hers. Bob popped his head up from the window, watching curiously. "You're here early," Lisa greeted, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the door. "Didn't sleep much," Daniel replied. His voice was low, rough from exhaustion. "Tell me about this witness." Lisa glanced around to make sure no one else was within earshot before continuing. "A guy came forward late last night. He claims he saw someone arguing near the Keller property the night Emily went missing." Her tone was clipped, as if she wasn't fully convinced. "Said he was too scared to talk before. Didn't want trouble. And now he's had a change of heart?" Daniel asked, skeptical. He knew how fear could paralyze people into silence, but he also knew how unreliable guilt-ridden stories could be. "Apparently, yeah. Chief thinks it's worth pursuing," Lisa said with a shrug. "I guess the guy couldn't take it anymore." Daniel frowned, processing the information. Witnesses driven by guilt often exaggerated or misremembered details. Still, after years with no leads, even the smallest thread was better than nothing. They had to act fast before the man's courage evaporated. "Where is he now?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but sharp. "Interrogation room 2, Lisa replied. "You want to handle it alone?" Daniel shook his head. "No, you're coming with me. Let's hear what he has to say." As they walked inside, the station buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Officers discussing cases, phones ringing incessantly. But for Daniel, the noise faded to a dull hum in the background. His focus was singular. This case had slipped through his fingers once before, and he wouldn't let it happen again. Outside, Bob remained alert in the car, his watchful eyes following Daniel through the glass. Somehow, Daniel found comfort in the thought that the dog was there, both of them confronting a past neither had asked for. The hallway leading to the interrogation rooms was quiet, dimly lit under flickering fluorescent lights. Daniel walked beside Lisa, his mind heavy with doubts. Witnesses who came forward after years of silence were often unreliable. Fear distorted memory, and guilt could create half-truths. Still, it was their first real lead in a case that had haunted him for years, and they couldn't afford to ignore it. He knew better than to expect closure, but maybe, just maybe, this man had something useful to offer. Lisa pushed the door to interrogation room 2 open, and Daniel stepped inside. The room was sterile and cold, with bare walls and a single metal table in the center. Sitting at the table was a man in his late 50s. His gray hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously between Daniel and Lisa. His hands fidgeted with a worn baseball cap, twisting the fabric in a restless rhythm. Daniel sat across from him, keeping his expression neutral and his tone steady. "Mr. Jacobs," Daniel said, "you came to us last night with information about the Keller case. We appreciate you stepping forward. But I need you to walk us through everything you remember from that night." Jacobs hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table as he swallowed hard. "I wasn't going to say anything," he muttered after a long pause. "Not back then. Not now. But I can't keep it to myself anymore. It's been tearing me apart." He took a shaky breath. "That night, I was walking near Keller's property. I'd been visiting my brother and didn't want to use the main road. I was cutting through the back trail when I heard voices." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What kind of voices?" "Arguing," Jacobs replied, his voice tense. Couldn't make out the words, but one of them sounded like a girl. Young. His hands tightened on the cap. "I didn't want to get involved, so I just kept my head down. But as I walked away, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. They followed for a few seconds, then stopped." Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing. "Did you see anyone? A face? A car? Anything?" Jacobs shook his head, his expression filled with regret. "No, I didn't look. I was scared. And when Emily went missing the next day, I knew I should have said something. But I didn't. I told myself it wouldn't have made a difference. Now I can't stop thinking about it. What if I could have helped?" Silence hung in the room as Daniel processed the story. It wasn't much, but the fear in Jacobs's voice felt real. The timeline matched, and even vague details were better than nothing. Still, Daniel knew they'd have to tread carefully. People driven by guilt often overcompensated in their statements. "We'll take your full statement," Daniel finally said, his voice even. "If anything else comes to mind, you call us." "Understood." Jacobs nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. As Lisa and Daniel left the room, she glanced sideways at him. "Think he's holding anything back?" she asked. "Could be," Daniel replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "But his fear feels genuine. We need to check the area near Keller's property again." As they walked through the station, Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing his car parked near the entrance. Inside, Bob sat alert, his eyes following Daniel through the glass. Something about the dog's presence felt grounding, a quiet reminder that both of them carried scars from the past. Now it was time to face his head-on. Daniel and Lisa drove out to the old Keller property in near silence. The road leading there was long and desolate, lined by skeletal trees that loomed in the misty morning light. Daniel kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind racing with the details Jacobs had provided. A vague memory of voices and footsteps wasn't much to go on, but they couldn't afford to ignore even the smallest lead. "Still think Jacobs is full of it?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, but he's definitely hiding something. Either he didn't see as much as he says, or he's afraid to tell us the rest. We've seen it before. Fear clouds judgment, especially when guilt takes over." Lisa hummed in agreement, her eyes scanning the empty fields passing by. "You know, if he's telling the truth, whoever was there that night might have been watching him too. Makes you wonder if someone wanted him to stay quiet." The words lingered uncomfortably in the air. Daniel had thought the same but hadn't said it out loud. Fear didn't just come from within, it was often enforced. Whoever had been near the Keller property that night might still be close. They could have been watching Jacobs all these years. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened at the thought. Finally, they arrived at the overgrown path leading to the back trails near the Keller land. The area hadn't changed much since the last time Daniel had been there. Weeds and tangled branches stretched across the dirt trail, but the skeletal remains of the old wooden fence that bordered the property were still visible. He parked the car, and the two stepped out into the crisp morning air. Bob barked softly from the back seat, his ears perked. "You staying or coming?" Daniel muttered to the dog, opening the door. Bob leapt out eagerly, sniffing the air with sharp curiosity. The dog's presence put Daniel strangely at ease. He gestured for Lisa to follow him as they started down the trail. "This place gives me the creeps," Lisa admitted, kicking a stone off the path. "I can't believe it's been 5 years already." Feels like yesterday we were out here, searching for any sign of her. Daniel nodded silently. He remembered every detail of those searches. Combing through the woods in cold rain, the hopeless faces of the Keller family when nothing was found. The same frustration bubbled under the surface now, but this time, there was a chance to do better. Bob walked a few feet ahead, sniffing at the ground. Suddenly, he stopped and growled low in his throat. Daniel froze, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "What is it?" Lisa asked, her voice sharp. Daniel approached slowly, watching as Bob stood rigid near a section of broken fence. The dog's nose twitched furiously, his body tense. Daniel knelt beside him and inspected the ground. There were faint impressions in the dirt, recent footprints, partially hidden by leaves and mud. "Footprints," Daniel murmured. "Someone's been here." Lisa crouched next to him, her face darkening. "Those don't look more than a day old. Whoever it was might have come back to check the area." Daniel stood, his jaw clenched. The trail was growing warmer than he expected. If Jacobs wasn't the only one haunted by that night, then time was running out to find whoever had been here. He gave Bob a brief pat on the head, his mind sharpening with resolve. "Let's keep going," he said quietly. "We might not be alone out here." Do you think Daniel and Lisa are walking into danger? Or was it all just a coincidence? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you caught any clues in this scene, let us know what you think is going on. Daniel and Lisa moved carefully along the overgrown trail, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The early fog still clung to the trees, wrapping the area in a heavy stillness. Bob sniffed ahead of them, his nose close to the earth as he followed a scent that had caught his attention. Daniel kept his eyes on the path, occasionally glancing at the footprints they had found earlier. Whoever had been here recently might still be close by. Lisa adjusted her jacket, her voice low but tense. Those prints looked fresh. If someone's coming back here after all this time, there's a reason. You think it's connected to the witness? Daniel nodded. Could be. Jacob said he felt like someone was following him that night. Maybe whoever it was has been keeping tabs on the area ever since. He glanced ahead at the trees. Some people can't leave the past behind, especially if they're trying to hide something. Bob suddenly stopped and let out a soft growl, his ears flattening slightly. Daniel immediately tensed and placed a hand on his holster. The dog sniffed the air, turning toward a dense cluster of trees to their left. Daniel and Lisa exchanged a glance before stepping off the main trail. The underbrush was thick, branches snapping under their boots as they moved through it. Bob led the way, his movements more cautious now. After several tense moments, they reached a clearing. Scattered on the ground were beer cans, a crumpled tarp, and cigarette butts, signs that someone had been camping here recently. Lisa crouched near the tarp, inspecting the area. "Looks like someone's been squatting out here," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe they've been watching this place for a while." Daniel crouched next to her, his gaze hardening as he scanned the campsite. "Or maybe they're hiding from something," he muttered. He picked up one of the cigarette butts and noticed how dry it was despite the recent rain. This wasn't left here long ago. They were probably here last night. Lisa stood and crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing in thought. If that's true, we might have scared them off when Jacobs came forward. Whoever it is, they know the area better than we do. Bob sniffed around the perimeter of the clearing, circling back to Daniel. The dog whimpered quietly, then nudged Daniel's leg. It was as if he sensed something deeper in the air, something unseen but lingering. Daniel gave him a reassuring pat and stood. "We need to process this site," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Get forensics out here. If they've been camping here, they've left something behind." Lisa nodded, pulling out her phone to call it in. As she spoke with dispatch, Daniel took a final look around the clearing. The weight of the past 5 years pressed heavily on him again. This trail had gone cold for so long, but now it was as if the case was breathing new life into itself. Someone had been here, watching, waiting, and they had missed it before. He wouldn't miss it again. Bob wagged his tail slightly, standing close to Daniel's side. The presence of the dog grounded him, reminding him that they both understood what it meant to carry old scars. With a deep breath, Daniel turned back to Lisa. "We're not leaving until we find out who's been out here," he said, his voice steady with determination. The fog around the trees seemed to thin, but Daniel knew the real shadows were still lurking somewhere deeper in the woods. The forest around them seemed to tighten as Daniel and Lisa continued along the trail. The fog had lifted, but the trees pressed close, their bare branches stretching overhead like brittle claws. Bob led the way, nose low to the ground, sniffing with intensity. Daniel followed in silence, his eyes scanning for any further signs of movement. He knew they were getting closer to something or someone, but whoever it was had left only faint traces. "You think this spot ever came up during the original search?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they moved deeper into the woods. "No," Daniel replied. "We stayed near the main trails back then. There was no reason to come this far out." He paused and pointed to a break in the underbrush. "But someone's been here recently. The trail's too fresh." Bob suddenly stopped near a tree, his body going rigid. He let out a soft but tense growl, ears flattening slightly. Daniel's gaze followed the dog's line of sight and caught a glimpse of a small opening between the trees. It looked unnatural. Branches bent aside and disturbed earth at its base. Lisa stepped forward, narrowing her eyes. "Looks like someone cut through here." Daniel nodded in agreement and cautiously approached the opening. The air felt colder, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Beyond the break in the trees was a shallow clearing, littered with old debris. A crumpled tarp, empty cans, and a stack of branches arranged in an odd makeshift barrier. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show someone had been camping here. "Squatter camp," Lisa murmured, crouching near the tarp. "Probably used it as a lookout point. Think it's related to the prince?" "Maybe," Daniel said, carefully stepping over to inspect the site. He ran a hand over one of the cans. It was dry despite the recent rain. "Whoever was here hasn't been gone long." He stood and glanced toward Bob, who was circling the edge of the camp with quiet intensity. The dog seemed agitated, his posture stiff. Daniel's instincts sharpened. He had seen this behavior before. Bob wasn't just curious. He was sensing something nearby. Daniel crouched beside him, running a hand along his back. "What is it, buddy? What are you picking up?" The dog didn't respond but kept his focus on the tree line. Lisa joined them, her expression tightening as she noticed the same unease. "Think they're watching us?" she asked quietly. "It's possible," Daniel muttered. "They might have seen us with Jacobs and decided to bail. If they're out here, they'll be desperate not to get caught." Bob growled softly again, and Daniel stood. He scanned the woods carefully, catching a flicker of movement in the distance. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill down his spine. Someone was out there. He could feel it. "We need to call this in," Lisa said, already pulling out her phone. "Agreed," Daniel replied, his voice low. "But we don't leave the area until forensics gets here. If they're nearby, I want eyes on every inch of this place." Lisa nodded and made the call, while Daniel continued to scan the clearing. The forest was still, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Yet, he knew the stillness was deceptive. Someone had lived out here, hidden in plain sight for years, and now they were on the run. Bob stood alert beside Daniel, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Daniel's jaw clenched as he considered their next move. Whoever had been in these woods wouldn't be able to hide much longer, not with the trail growing warmer by the minute. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line. He could swear he'd seen movement. It was subtle, just a shadow slipping between the trees, but enough to keep him on edge. Bob let out a low growl, his tense posture confirming Daniel's instincts. Whoever had been out here might still be nearby, watching. Lisa finished her call to dispatch and joined him. "Forensics is on the way. They'll be here in about 20 minutes. "They're already moving," Daniel muttered. "But panic leaves a trail. They'll make mistakes." Bob led them down a narrow path, his nose to the ground. The trees pressed in, blocking the light and casting long, shifting shadows. The stillness of the forest sharpened Daniel's senses. Every rustle, every creak of branches heightened his awareness. He glanced at Lisa. "Think they've been out here all this time, keeping an eye on the property?" "Could be," Lisa replied. "Maybe Jacob's showing up spooked them." Bob suddenly stopped, barking once before freezing near a cluster of trees. Daniel followed his gaze to a small structure, an old, rotting shed hidden by the overgrowth. "Did we check this during the original search?" Lisa asked. "No," Daniel said, shining his flashlight toward the shed. "It wasn't on the property records." They approached cautiously. The door hung on rusted hinges, creaking as Daniel nudged it open. Inside, they found signs of a makeshift camp, broken tools, an old sleeping bag, and empty cans. Daniel knelt beside a torn canvas bag, unzipping it to reveal a flashlight, a map, and a bottle. "Look at this," he murmured, unfolding the map. Trails were marked around the Keller property, some leading to spots they hadn't searched before. "They've been tracking the area," Lisa said. "Whoever it is, they've been preparing for something." Bob barked again, alerting them to movement at the clearing's edge. Daniel tensed, his pulse quickening. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes. They weren't just chasing shadows anymore. Someone was out there, and Daniel had no intention of letting them disappear again. The forest felt heavier with each step Daniel and Lisa took. The path narrowed, winding through dense clusters of trees. Bob kept moving ahead, his ears twitching and his nose glued to the ground. The trail had become more chaotic. Footprints overlapped, branches broken as if someone had fled in haste. Whoever had been hiding out here was running, but Daniel knew fear wouldn't keep them far for long. "Looks like they panicked," Lisa said, brushing aside a branch as they followed the trail. "You think they've doubled back somewhere?" "Maybe," Daniel replied, "but running in these woods isn't random. They know the area too well. It's like they've got fallback routes planned." He scanned the surrounding trees, every muscle in his body tense. Something felt off, like they were being herded into unfamiliar terrain. The forest was too quiet now. Just the soft crunch of their footsteps and Bob's sniffing broke the silence. Minutes later, they found another sign of human presence. A makeshift barricade of branches and old wire stretched between two trees, hidden under a thick layer of moss. Bob stopped in front of it, sniffing and pawing at the ground. Daniel crouched down and found another rusted trap, partially camouflaged under the leaves. It wasn't set, but it was clearly meant as a deterrent. "Traps and barriers," Daniel muttered. "Whoever they are, they're guarding this area like it's sacred ground." Lisa crossed her arms. "Or maybe they're keeping people out because they've got something to hide. If this has been here since Emily Keller disappeared, it could explain why no one ever found anything." Bob barked sharply again, cutting through the stillness. Daniel turned to see the dog dart forward toward a cluster of rocks. There, just beyond the ridge, Daniel spotted a flicker of movement. He drew his weapon, motioning for Lisa to cover his left flank. They moved quickly and silently, keeping low to the ground as they approached. Lisa signaled for him to stop. "Over there," she whispered, pointing ahead. Through a gap in the trees, they saw a figure. Someone crouched low, peering nervously over their shoulder. The person was wrapped in a dark, ragged coat, their face partially obscured by a hood. They moved slowly, almost limping, as if injured or exhausted. "Do you see that limp?" Daniel whispered. "They're not getting far." Lisa nodded. "Let's box them in." The two detectives split up, moving carefully through the trees to cut off the person's escape route. Bob remained at Daniel's side, his growls low and steady. They approached the figure from both sides, Daniel emerging first with his weapon drawn. "Freeze!" Daniel commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. The person flinched, stumbling backward, but they didn't run. Instead, they held up trembling hands in surrender. Lisa appeared from the opposite side, closing off any chance of escape. "Turn around." Slowly, Lisa ordered. The figure complied, lowering their hood. Beneath it was a man, gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with terror. Dirt and grime coated his face and hands. He opened his mouth to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper. "Please," the man rasped. "I didn't mean for any of this. It wasn't supposed to happen." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Who are you? And what are you doing out here?" The man hesitated, glancing between the two detectives and Bob, who continued to growl softly. Finally, he spoke, his voice shaking. I saw it. I was here the night the girl disappeared. I've been hiding ever since." Daniel exchanged a tense look with Lisa. They were finally face to face with someone who might hold the truth about what had happened 5 years ago. But the fear in the man's eyes told Daniel that whatever he knew, it was far worse than anything they had imagined. Daniel and Lisa kept their weapons lowered but ready. The man trembled, shifting nervously on his feet. His eyes darted around as if expecting someone, or something, to appear from the woods. Bob remained tense, his body low and his gaze fixed on the stranger. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Start from the beginning," Daniel said. "What did you see the night Emily Keller disappeared?" The man wiped a shaky hand across his face, his breath coming in short gasps. "I was camping out here," he began. "I wasn't supposed to be on the property, but I didn't think anyone cared. That night, I heard voices near the trail. A girl was arguing with a man. I couldn't see them clearly, but it got heated. Then he swallowed hard. Then I heard her scream." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Did you get a good look at him?" The man shook his head frantically. "No," panicked. "I didn't want to be seen. I stayed hidden, but I heard him dragging something, her, I think. I ran. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd be safe. But after a few days, I started hearing things. Footsteps, whispers, like someone knew I was out here and didn't want me talking." Lisa exchanged a glance with Daniel. "You think someone's been stalking you all these years?" she asked. The man nodded violently. "Yes, they leave traps, watch from the trees. I've moved camp dozens of times, but they always find me." He gestured toward the trail behind him. "They're still out there, waiting." Daniel's instincts flared. It wasn't just fear driving this man, it was survival. Someone had been protecting the secret of Emily's disappearance, going to extreme lengths to keep witnesses silent. He knew they didn't have much time. Whoever was watching would realize soon enough that their hiding spot was compromised. "We need to get you out of here," Daniel said firmly. He turned to Lisa. "Call for backup again. We're not alone out here." Lisa nodded and spoke into her radio, relaying their position and requesting immediate assistance. The man glanced nervously between the trees. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They don't want you here. They'll come after all of us." "Let them try," Daniel replied coldly. "We're done running." The tension thickened as the forest remained eerily silent. Daniel kept Bob close as they began escorting the man toward the clearing. Every sound, every crunch of leaves and rustling branch, felt amplified, as if the woods themselves were watching. Bob stopped occasionally, his ears twitching, before moving forward again. They finally reached the spot where forensics had begun setting up a perimeter. Officers emerged from the trees, armed and alert. The man sagged in relief at the sight of them, but Daniel remained on edge. He knew whoever had been out here wouldn't give up easily. Lisa approached, walking beside him. "Think they'll come after us now? They've been hiding for years." The second Jacobs talked, they panicked. "Desperate people make mistakes," Daniel said. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Bob barked once, breaking the quiet. Daniel looked down at the dog, then back toward the woods. Somewhere beyond the trees, the person responsible for Emily's disappearance was still out there. But for the first time in years, the truth was within reach. Daniel wasn't going to stop until he found it.